Well, great. Welcome everybody to this first of a series of series of events that the South Asia Institute is sponsoring this year, and especially this fall. The series is South Asian Studies: The View from Colombia. And it's the opportunity for us all to have a chance to meet and hear from our faculty. And one of the reasons that we're doing this semester is, well, I took over the directorship in the middle of the summer, in the middle of this pandemic, of directorship of the Institute. And I'm thinking, well, how are we going to how am I going to see people? And the usual format of just the occasional Monday colloquium didn't quite seem to be adequate for the purpose. I think because, first of all, there are a million lectures, external lectures out there. Hello? You can, getting some strange sound there. And there are many lectures, on campus and across the world that we can have access to. And I would just as a little side note, point out that Berkeley, for example, has a series of colloquia and lectures that they advertise widely, and I think anybody can probably jump into those. And we will be having our own as well, but for our purposes here, sort of having been away on leave and stuff, I was really felt acutely the fact that we really need community, and students especially who pass through the university so quickly. For them, this time of isolation is a very high percentage of your experience at Columbia. So this is a way to, at least for those of you who I can see live or a picture of, at least we can see what each other looks like, we can hear each other, we can think together, and also have a chance to meet with the faculty, faculty that you may not actually have a chance to be in a class with, for example. So we're engaging with students across the disciplines with our amazing faculty through this series. I also want to point out that we've also scheduled several book events that are not on this list of master classes, but are on the list of events, because they'll be set up a little bit differently. I didn't want to confuse the issue with these classes where I'm asking you to read a certain amount for the class with other sort of more public-facing events, such as a series of celebrations of the books of faculty who have recently published or who will be publishing this year. And these events will also be spread out over the course of the year. So keep an eye on the events calendar of the Institute. And we'll also be having other things, some workshops on, a workshop on COVID in India and its effects, and also external speakers coming. The first coming up is actually Amitav Ghosh, who will be speaking, I believe it's September 30th, on environmental issues. So you can see that. I didn't write down the details here, but you can see that on the list of events. Okay, so that's just a kind of a general welcome to the Institute and what we're up to this year. Today's class will be led by Sudipta Kaviraj, Professor of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies here at Columbia. And I believe currently the Director of Graduate Studies in MISAS. Correct.
Very reluctantly.
Pardon?
Very reluctantly.
Okay. Nevertheless, participating in this service to you all and the university. He is a specialist in intellectual history and Indian politics, who, like a couple of other faculty you'll be hearing from this year, including Partha Chatterjee next week, has been a member of the Subaltern Studies Collective, which has reshaped the historiography of South Asia and played a central role in the development of post-colonial studies, not just in South Asia, but globally. He has published numerous books, including several recent books, although I found it hard to sort of track down exactly all of them. So I'm just going to mention a few of the recent ones. The Imaginary Institution of India in 2010, The Trajectories of the Indian State in 2010, and The Invention of Private Life, Literature and Ideas in 2015. And these should give you a range, that one very much focused on literature and culture, that should give you an idea of the interdisciplinary range of his thinking. And I should also mention, in case you sort of come in late or something, that in preparation for each of these lectures, the speaker has suggested readings from their own work that are relevant to the lecture, which students have been encouraged to read in advance. So if you somehow didn't have access to the readings, then let Bill know and we can make sure you can see them. So with that, I will just say that today's lecture, I don't know that we did a formal title for it, and it's not actually a lecture. The idea for today is that Partha will speak for just 10 or 15 minutes, and then we will encourage you to participate in a discussion of his work based on the readings that you've been asked to look at for today. So we'll see how it goes. I know not all of you are participating in the class for credit, but hopefully as an intellectual community, you will actively get involved and in this lecture and in the ensuing lectures going forward. Just before we talked, Sudipta and I talked just before the Zoom meeting started, and he suggested that I make some comments on the readings and or just on the sequence of thinking that we see in these readings. And I'm not going to say a lot specific right now. I think we should hear you, sort of hear how you're reflecting about the sequence of readings that you've presented us and what you're thinking about now. But I think that one thing that Partha has communicated is the importance of, Marx's thinking has been, of course, central in the sort of identity of, and the inspiration for social movements across the world. But there's always been this difficult question of how to reconcile the kind of universalist thinking that underlies much of Marx's thinking with the idea of the way that relations of production and such create the conditions for social order. And I think that what Sudipta is doing is thinking about how we take this issues of universal human condition versus the historical specificity of our ways of thinking about them ourselves, and thinks about them in the post-colonial environment of especially of South Asia. And I know that when I talk with my students about how to think about Marx in relationship to their particular work, and just recently talking to somebody who felt, what happens to culture in all of this, or what happens to thinking about Islam, for example, for those students who are concerned with sort of the place of Islam in the modern world, when you have a theory that is so grounded in the issue of political economy and the sort of material foundations of our lives, and are struggling with how to put these things together. But let me turn to you, Sudipta, and then I think once we hear your specific thoughts and it's out in the more sort of concrete way, then we can get into some of the issues that I think, the various issues that many of our students bring to the table. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks very much for this opportunity to interact with students, and it's a very special, I think, unique event, because when we teach, then of course all of ourselves, in a certain sense, is present in the teaching, but all parts of ourselves actually do not teach at the same time. So when I teach South Asian politics, there's only one side of my intellectual preoccupation, etc., which is foregrounded. But this gives an opportunity to, both to reflect on your own work. What I want to do in the initial remarks, I want to take about 15, 20 minutes to go over essentially the different points of turn in my thinking, points of turn in the sense that, different points where I felt that I faced a big problem, or I faced a point which is like a crossroads where you have to choose which way you move. And the decisions that I have taken in a certain sense, because I think it might be useful for the students who are at the beginning of their career to see something like this, because I think as they evolve into scholars themselves, I think they will have to do something similar. Is that all right?
And I think this is great, because one of the things that I didn't say in my remarks was that I have asked each of you to think about whatever you're talking about with us in the context of an intellectual trajectory, because I think one of the most important things we do as faculty is model to students not just the sort of the high points of one's intellectual life, but those moments of making decisions, and as you're saying. So I think that's wonderful.
Okay, so I'll be brief. I think thinking is a paradoxical, two-sided activity. On the one side, I think thinking means that you make an effort to come to a conclusion which seems to you to be justified and grounded at that particular moment. But thinking also means that you always preserve the right and exercise the right to change your mind, because you are constantly forced to change your mind as you open up towards the world, both your access to the world itself, the historical world, which is the world that I deal with, but also we cannot deal with the historical world without going through a world of concept, world of thinking. That actually gives us our access into the historical world. And just as we, the basic critical move in the Kantian sense would be that we must understand the difficulties that arise from the object that we want to study. There are some difficulties which arise from the, the apparatus with which we try to see the object. So some of the difficulties might come from the smallness or bigness or something like the object that I want to see, but something might also actually come from the nature of my vision. So I think thinking to me always means that you have to be careful and aware of these two sides of the thinking process. Now, um, it's also interesting that I'm doing this at a time when I've been forced, in a certain sense, through circumstances, to write something like a book on um, Marxism in India, Bengal, my own response to that Marxism, etc. So it is a point where I'm thinking about some of these things. So I say in that in one of those essays that I did not have to enter into Marxism as a conscious decision because my father was a Marxist, my mother, both my parents were in the Communist Party. So in a certain sense, the what Hindu philosophers would call Sanskara, that is the thoughts through which you think, but which Sanskara actually means two things, that the thoughts through which you think, but there is also a particular kind of, um, inexplicable givenness to those thoughts, that you are not aware that those are the thoughts through which you think. So there is a kind of double givenness about it. And that is why it makes it very difficult to reach back into those thoughts, which are thoughts which stand behind your thinking, as it were, and they are beyond your access. And you have to make a special effort, special critical effort to grasp at them, to bring them from the back of your thinking to the front of your eyes, and to make them subject of critical attention. So, but uh, let me say initially, very telegraphically, there were two things which struck me immediately with that kind of Marx. Three things probably. The first thing, which is unproblematic and wonderful, was a certain kind of cosmopolitanism, a kind of easy and sympathetic openness to the world. Not to be put off by something which is unfamiliar, but to find the unfamiliar interesting and fascinating. I think this is something which is forgotten sometimes of the left tradition of the 30s, 40s, 50s, but I think it is something which is very valuable. But there were two things which struck me. On the one side, what attracted me to Marxism, of course, was its central focus on the question of, let me now be a bit careful and put it this way, uh, its central focus on what they saw, and I also saw, following my father, let us say, or his friends, as the question of poverty. Right. But now I would reformulate it slightly and say that degradation only in the form of poverty. But I think that's an important question because there are two ways in which you can think about this. Either you can say poverty is the only form of degradation that I would admit into my thinking, or you can be displaced through your thinking by your openness to the world, by going to Delhi and encountering a world which is a really heavily caste-laden world, which I did not find very much in my early experience in Kolkata. And then you might feel that you have to open up your sense of how people are degraded in the world beyond the question of poverty into caste, untouchability, etc. So that was not given to me through my experience in Kolkata, either through my personal experience or through the Marxism which was handed down to me. Now, the second thing which I immediately found in that Marxism as I grew up was a certain kind of woodenness and a clunkiness about the apparatus, the lack of suppleness, lack of refinement, and tendency to discover iron laws in everything. And if your world is cluttered with too many iron laws, then the scope for your own thinking is limited very severely. So that is something that did not attract me. And I think, like Partha and many others in our generation, we were attracted uh, types of Marxian thinking which were, I think, not favored by Bengali Marxists of the earlier generation, except for one or two very exceptional people. Sushman Sarkar, I think, was one who was attracted to Gramsci. Ranajit Guha was another, who was attracted to Gramsci and Hegel and structuralism, all kinds of things. But we must also understand that Ranajit Guha was peculiar in one thing, that he was formed by Bengali Marxism, but much of his mature thinking life was actually spent outside in Europe. Anyway, I very quickly found as so let me tell you what I started reading in order to get over this kind of, uh, a Marxism which was too full of iron laws. I was attracted to Lukács, and through Lukács, I realized that, many, many very important issues in Marxism, concepts in Marxism, remain misunderstood if you do not engage very heavily with the heritage of Hegelianism. And so Hegel to me became very, very important. And I was initially, I think I read Kojèv's book, Introduction to the Study of Hegel, which has a misleading title because it's not Hegel. It's essentially reading 2 or 3 chapters of the phenomenology of the mind. But it also opened my eyes in the sense that it showed me how closely you could read. Much, much later, 30 years later, I also realized some dangers of the Kojèv kind of reading because it turns Hegel into somebody who is too much of a Marxist or too much of a pre-Marxist. But there was no doubt that, it was an amazing experience reading that. So one thing that I read with great interest was Lukács, and through Lukács into Hegel. The second thing which I found very interesting, coming through Sushman Sarkar, but Sushman Sarkar was not a very immediate presence in my life. The person who I think actually influenced me and Partha very deeply, also Dipesh, all of us acknowledge that, was Ashok Sen, who was an economist, but I think he was more of a sociologist, and who really opened the works of Gramsci to me. So I read Gramsci carefully. And I was also very deeply influenced by both structuralism generally and Althusser. I'm saying structuralism generally because if you look at some of my essays on Bengali literature, particularly when I study uh, stories or something like that, you will immediately see that there's a huge influence of technical structuralist methods of reading texts and particularly reading narratives in my thinking, even now. And I've never found any reason to reconsider it or change it. So these were 3 very big influences on my thinking. But there was also 2 problems. Again, I'll put it very sharply so that we can have a discussion. I immediately felt that since I was a political science student and my intellectual problem was essentially to understand the world of politics. The world of politics in 2 senses, the world of politics as events, like great revolutions, etc., but also the world of politics as kind of mute and silent and unhistoricized, in the sense unchronicled suffering of people because of the existence of social and state power. I think that is also the other side of the study of politics. I felt that the Marxism that I had received, but I would now make a distinction between 2 levels of the received Marxism. One was the Marxism that I had received from my Bengali forebears, the part of Marx that they had ingested and then handed over to me. But received Marxism to me now meant, let's say 10 years after, or 6, 7 years after starting to teach in JNU, which was a great experience because teaching always allows you to clarify your own thoughts to yourself. Because if you are doing that in front of a bunch of very intelligent young people who are also irreverent, they should be irreverent, I think it forces you to be clear and precise in your thinking. I'm very grateful for that opportunity of teaching in JNU. But I felt that there were 2 problems which were rising very sharply. One is, it seemed that Marxism was not a very good theory for politics. or Marxism of the received kind didn't give me very much to think about politics in an explanatory sense. Let me explain what I mean by that. It gave me a lot about uh, revolution, and but I felt increasingly that what it gave me about revolution was uh, a kind of slapdash theory of a bourgeois state, which did not go into the bourgeois state either historically or analytically very deeply. It had a kind of casual condemnatory view of the of the bourgeois state. Not in case of Marx. I don't know if we would have the time to do it. But I think, or let me put it this way, very sharply. Uh, at that point, I felt that this was simply my straining against that iron law reductionist, economistic kind of form of Marxism. That if you accept that kind of reductionism, then it's a labor-saving device in the sense that then there's very little to explain in politics except referring the causality to the economic sphere, right? Uh, that basically made you unemployed as a political scientist. To say that if you're a Marxist, then there's not much political analysis that you have to do. There are hard decisions to take about political action, but analysis is not very important. Not very important. So it made me uneasy about that. I wrote a paper very early in a discussion I organized with Krishna Bharadwaj, my colleague at JNU, which was a conference on Marx, Keynes, and Schumpeter. And I wrote a paper called on political explanation in Marxism, where what I said was, I said that the term determination seemed to me in good Marxist theory, or Marxist theory which is infused by Hegel to some extent. But Hegel is not a very good guide on this particular question. To um, uh, that determination, I, or let me put it this way. By that time, I was quite attracted to the Althusserian kind of position of structural causation, or to say that a historical event can be analyzed only by the structure in dominance, which basically meant that the notion of causality that you are using is not a reductionist notion of causality. It's a non-reductionist notion of causality, and which is captured by the idea of overdetermination. And because I was also very influenced by analytic philosophy at that point, I felt that what overdetermination does is to produce, in analytical terms, an effect of underdetermination. Underdetermination means that the economy determines means that the economy underdetermines. The economy does not, economic pressures do not yield a result. The economic pressures at most, yield a kind of field or a range out of which a particular outcome would emerge, right? It is never something which actually produces or forces through a particular kind of outcome. So that's why I was attracted to Althusser. And I found that there's some theories of conjunctive causation in analytic philosophy which are very similar. They're practically a kind of rendering in a different language. The same argument that you get in Althusser drawing from Freud, the idea of overdetermination. On the other hand, the other thing that troubled me very deeply was the point that Kathy mentioned, which must be absolutely central to any one of us studying non-European societies, that Marxism, along with the great European tradition of modern social thought, is essentially, to my mind, a self-reflection of European modernity. It thinks about European modernity and produces explanations about aspects of European modernity. It's basically asking the question, what is happening to ourselves? And what it does, I sometimes tell students, is like, I'm fond of watching soccer, football, on the TV. And what social theory does is a bit like what television replay of football does, that somebody actually scores a wonderful goal, and it happens in the blink of an eye in the actual game. But when the game is replayed, uh, the replay actually shows exactly how the ball was struck, exactly how it curved, and exactly how it went into the goal, etc. So it basically wants to show you what is crucial at a particular moment of play, but amplified analytically so that we can actually look at it more minutely and try to understand it better. So I felt that much of Western social theory is like that. They pick up a process and then they produce that kind of intense analytic technique of trying to understand that process. So Tocqueville does that about democracy. Marx does that about the economy. Marx and Adam Smith do that about the economy. Weber does that about the state to some extent, Foucault, etc. So these are all the different theories of modernity. They are like that. But they're all self-reflections of European modernity. So the big question for me was, what do we do when we take something like Marxism onto a historical field, which is the non-European field? And you will see how I try to address that problem in the paper that I circulated, Outline of a Revisionist Theory of Modernity, where I give you a reading of Marx. It's not a very unorthodox reading. It has a slightly unorthodox emphasis, uh, but it's also not very unorthodox. People who have read Gramsci know that very well, that Marx talks about the first and the second way. So I argue that in Marx himself, there are two pictures of the rise of capitalism. One is a broad picture, which is the picture of what happens in Europe. But Marx is also aware, as Weber said, that uh, the history, you cannot write a history of capitalism. You can only write history of capitalisms in particular societies. I don't think Marx is unaware of that. He doesn't do that very much in Capital. But when you come to the end of Capital Volume 1, you will see that he's already coming into that. And that's the context in which he makes a distinction between the first way and the second way, the really revolutionary way in England and France, and the second way or late capitalism way in Italy, Germany, Russia, etc. So I argue in that you know if you see that, and there's also an element there which is mine. It's not something which I got from Marx. In the early part of that paper, I say that the history of European modernity can be seen and has been seen in two different ways. One is the story of symmetry, and the other one is the story of sequence. And I think it's essentially Marxist historians like E.P. Thompson or Hans Medic and people who have done sometimes very detailed discussion about European history who have emphasized that point of the sequential relationship between democracy and capitalism rather than a symmetrical relation between democracy and capitalism. So this is something which struck me very powerfully. It didn't come from Marx or Hegel. It came essentially through reflection on, sort of trying to grapple with that. And then my argument is that if, therefore, I recognize a kind of logic of self-pluralization in the development of modernity in Europe itself. And if that is true of Europe, then how can it be that when modernity goes out of Europe, then modernity can become a story of replication? It cannot be a story of replication, except in a very, very broad, misleadingly sort of broad and vague sense. So that's what that paper does. And while teaching in JNU, very quickly, I thought that, this is another question that we have to grapple with. I was attracted to subaltern studies because I thought that the work in subaltern studies was dealing with this. Ronit does work on peasant rebellion. Partho's emphasis, for instance, on the importance of community to the peasant society and to the peasantry, which conventional Marxists had neglected. They saw peasantry essentially as a class. And what was very interesting about Partho's work that he was saying that, but it's equally important at least to see that the peasantry actually acts as, um, you know, as an unfragmented community, not as a class always, which was also going against, the logic of the famous paper by Mao on analysis of classes in Chinese society, which gives you the impression that, the peasantry fragments into different classes. But the emphasis in Partho's work, for instance, in subaltern studies, is to say that, you can also see the opposite logic in history quite often. I participated in subaltern studies in a peculiar way, in the sense that I wrote only one paper. Initially, I wrote that paper as a part of my book on Bunkim, but Ronit said that you should give that to subaltern studies. So I took it out from the Bunkim book and altered it a little bit and gave it to subaltern studies. But I've not participated in subaltern studies in terms of writing repeatedly the way Partho or Dipesh or Gautam they have. But I have been part of the project in that sense. Now, finally, um, so the thing that I wanted you to read dealt with Marx's own historical evolution. I think there are two places where you can see that argument. One is a very early paper that I wrote, which is a much more logically inclined paper. It's called On the Status of Marx's Writings on India, which was written, I think, in '83 and published in the Social Scientist. But it's entirely concerned with the logic of a category in Marx. But some of it is summarized in a much later, recent paper I've done for Constellation on which is called Marx and Post-Colonial Thinking. Now, I became interested in the logic of post-colonial thinking because of this. And let me put that very sharply and crudely. I felt increasingly the task of post-colonial thinking was to address a question which seems to me to be the central epistemic question of modern social science for people like us, that modern social science has given us in the last 50 years a vast stock of historical knowledge and descriptive empirical knowledge about non-European societies. But the theoretical language, the theoretical language, like using categories like state, market, law, etc., that theoretical language is deeply infused by a theory, which is the theory which is, unsurprisingly, um, generated out of reflection on European modernity. So that's why I think the shape of knowledge in the social sciences is very asymmetric. So I have argued that if you have three levels of knowledge in a certain sense, empirical historical knowledge, then analysis and analytical level, and then a theoretical level, right? On the side of European social science, you have all three levels, and all three levels are very full. If you go into the non-European world, you will find that the historical level is very full. The analytical level is also sometimes very good, but the theoretical level is very poor in the sense that the theoretical concepts are very often drawn from the European side and dragged into the history of the Middle East, history of South Asia, etc., where they do not work. And so the great example would be that we have to think theoretically about caste. You cannot simply pretend that it's a form of class. If you do a kind of class analysis, it would simply break down. So I see the task of post-colonial theory to be primarily that, not just to complain against the hegemony of European theory. I think hegemony of European thought is the theoretical hegemony of European thought, right? And the theoretical hegemony of European thought cannot be changed. I would not say broken, cannot be changed if we actually do not do the third level of reflection more on our own history. And I'll give an example, two examples. I was forced to do that when I started thinking about communities a little bit, and I felt that what I got from Tony, whose work I find very, very interesting, did not give me my concept. So I have to make a distinction between a sense of community which is unenumerated or fuzzy and an enumerated sense of community, which is quite different, right? Partho, thinking about Indian democracy, similarly, uh, in order to grapple with something which is very important problem in Indian democracy, but not uh, significant to that extent in Western democracies, maybe in other parts of the world, everywhere, as you said, but not in European democracies where the theory is built. So he has to make a distinction between civil and political society. So that is the kind of thing which I think seems to me to be the main task of post-colonial thinking. Finally, so I wanted to end with just one remark. If we want to do that, I think we have to be open, uh, but open is a difficult term, open to languages which are different from the languages of Marxism. We must actually learn to read those languages. Reading Foucault or reading Gramsci, Foucault, Gramsci, of course, is simple because they're actually offshoots of Marxism in a sense. Reading Hegel or reading uh, other European thinkers who inhabit, in a certain sense, a different language is not so difficult. Weber, for instance. But I think to open up our history, if we are seriously interested in our history, we have to go into languages which are languages of pre-modern Indian thought, uh, where language occurs in two senses. First of all, much of it is either in Sanskrit or Persian or in medieval vernacular. So we have to learn those things. And if we want to understand the thought of pre-modern societies, we have to understand the language of religion, uh, without which we cannot do that. You can say that, well, uh, I'm not interested in the pre-modern. That's fine. But if you are interested in the pre-modern, or if you are interested in longitudinal history in a certain sense, for me, because I'm interested in Tagore, the modern thinker, but I think when Tagore thinks about love, Tagore thinks about nature, Tagore thinks about the presence of God in the world, I think there's a huge connection with thinking that comes from the Vaishnavas and others. So I cannot understand that. I cannot understand Tagore fully if I do not understand that as well. And so I'll finish with this. I've always been deeply fascinated by Walter Benjamin. But now I think that I'm fascinated by Walter Benjamin for uh, two reasons. One is, of course, the attraction of Benjamin's skill in analyzing cultural forms and things like that. But I now feel that what draws me to Walter Benjamin is this: he's an absolutely peculiar, exceptional Marxist, who is deeply into the language of Marxism, obviously. But Benjamin would not be Benjamin if he's not also deeply into a language of historical sorrow of a particular kind, which is peculiar to the Jewish people. And it is that which fascinates us. Think of the passage of the angel of history, right? I think it's very hard for any Marxist to write that passage. History has an angel. There's a storm which is blowing from where? The storm is blowing from paradise. And the angel's wings are caught in this, and the debris of civilization is accumulating at his feet. So I think it is an absolutely amazing deployment of a language, of a kind of language, which I think Marxism and modern theoretical thinking, in a certain sense, is about. So I think that is something which I find very interesting and attractive now. I do not know where I would go if I follow it too far. I do not mean that I would become a Vaishnava, but I come from a Vaishnava family, however. But anyway, I don't think I would become a Vaishnava. But what I find is that if you overcome some of these prejudices, modern prejudices, then you see a lot of things which are deep thoughts in those traditions, not only the Vaishnava tradition, the other tradition that attracts me very deeply is the Kashmiri Shaivite aesthetic tradition, not the religious theological part, but the aesthetic tradition. So that is where I am, as always, undecided between uh, different traditions and languages of thought, which I find attractive, but also sometimes risky. You do not know where you would slide if you go too far into those. But I think that is both the difficulty of thinking about things, and it's also the enjoyment of thinking about things. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So I mean, you raised a lot of issues that I think are really central to what many of us are thinking about and concerned with today. But in the interests of encouraging everybody to think and react, I will turn it over to you all for thoughts, questions, comments. How we do that I don't know, Bill, do you manage this or right now? Oh, I see 2 participants have raised hands. Bill, can you manage this or do I need to?
No, I think Bill can. Bill can. Bill is the host.
Okay.
What I shall do is, I'm sorry, I went on for too long. I didn't want to do it.
Well, it's great. It was great. It was great.
But what I shall do is, I'll be brief in my responses so that we can have, a wider discussion. Yeah.
Okay, so we have 2 participants with raised hands. I don't know so let me just see if I can see who they are.
I think Avnish Mehra,
if you
and Anna Mishra.
Okay, so let's do them in that order. I see where the hands are. Okay.
Maybe if you just unmute yourselves and then ask your question or your comment.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Professor Kaviraj. This was very enlightening. I'm full disclosure, I am a little bit more of a Vaishnav, so that is kind of my perspective of thinking. Although I try to understand all religions, and this is kind of where my research is. I wanted to ask you about the piece, the 2009 Marxism in Translation piece. There was a part of it where you talk about how some of the major drawbacks of Brahmanical learning is about its textualization of the world. And so I kind of wanted to understand that a little bit better, because it was my understanding that their tradition was originally more of an oral tradition, and then later is sort of codified textually. So I kind of wanted to know, and I don't know how much you know about this, but how much did that kind of change that process of trying to understand the information that was coming to those Brahmins from wherever they were getting it and disseminating that information to people? And then kind of along those lines, I was really fascinated throughout your pieces about kind of this discussion between class and caste. And I almost feel like they are very, very similar. It's somewhat hard to kind of differentiate. And although there is a sort of rigid feeling to what caste is, I've always kind of seen it as something that is constantly evolving, and there can be some caste mobility up and down depending on the way that you move around and you connect with people and things like that. So just if you could give me some insight into both of these.
Yeah, first of all, both are great questions, very important questions. To answer the first question, I should first apologize for writing in a way which is likely, I wouldn't say irresponsible, but when you write, you enter into a language, and the language, there is a kind of tangibility and there's language has a life of its own in a certain sense, and what I did there was probably something which would appeal to Marxists more when I say that it's a Brahminical way of thinking. But let me make 2 points very quickly. What I really think about Brahminical thinking and what I meant by Brahminical thinking in that particular locution. I think Brahminical thinking is a very big issue. There's no doubt that much of the thinking in the Indian tradition was done by Brahmin. I don't think it's a peculiar fault of the Indian tradition. In all traditions, as you go backwards in time, it would be the thinking would be done by a narrower and narrower group of intellectuals, and those intellectuals would be associated with privilege, power, etc. And European thinkers, they don't give up all of Aristotle because Aristotle defends slavery. So it's not surprising that it's Brahminical. Brahminical in origin and Brahminical in its orientation also sometimes. But what I meant, and the question of orality and textuality is a very interesting and deep question, because I think what the Indian tradition does But don't read me in a chauvinistic way. I'm not saying that only the Indian tradition does, because there's a way of talking where when you say the European tradition does or the Indian tradition does, there's an only which exists, sits in bracket in front of that. That's not what I mean. It can be found, I'm sure it can be found in the Islamic tradition, and it can be found in African, etc. What I mean is that the use of textuality and orality is very different in a pre-modern situation. So textuality is sometimes a kind of distilling, a recording of a distillation of a thinking process which has gone on for some time. And much of the thinking process actually goes orally. It does in our time as well. What I'm doing today with you is oral thinking, and it is not going to be written down every sentence of it. But presumably it has a certain role in advancing my thinking and advancing your advancing in the sense that it becomes an input in your thinking. So I think things are textualized, and then that textualized body of knowledge or thinking is then oralized in the sense that people use it in different types of contexts. And then when a new body of thought, which is very significant, arises, it's again textualized through commentary and things like that. So there's a kind of textualized sedimentation process, which I think we need to understand better. We should get out of this prejudice that commentary is passive. Commentary is extremely creative in both the Hindu and the Islamic tradition, a little bit of it that I know. Now, but I did not mean by Brahminical use or textualization, I didn't mean that in that particular sentence. What I meant is something else, which is also, I think, part of the part of Brahminical knowledge, that something gets textualized, and the live intellectual process, which produces the knowledge that goes into the text, that live intellectual process somehow, becomes decayed and degraded. Sometimes it actually becomes dissociated from the text. And the text then becomes something, which gets a life of its own in a different sense. That, in order to give an advice about agriculture, originally there might have been some connection between, a certain understanding of stars and things like that, and weather. But the weather element completely disappeared, and it becomes something which is just a textual world, which is closed in upon itself. And so the world inside the text, which was sometimes a historical world somewhere, right? But the world inside the text actually becomes your world. And you cannot come out of the world of the text into the world in which you inhabit. This is what I meant, because so this was a remark about using a European theory in a non-European world. And on the question of caste and class, I think this is one of the it is the greatest question, in a sense, if you want to understand Indian social history, right? I have some papers in which I have argued that in Marx's use, there are two meanings of the term class. For instance, when Marx says, all history is the history of class struggle, right? That uses class as any kind of stratificational system in any social form. Any is the important word, any social form, any stratificational system. So it's very vague and it's very general. If you know that, the third volume of Capital, I think, finishes with an unfinished chapter on class. He begins that chapter, he never finishes it. And if you read that, not that just that chapter, but the use of the term class in Capital, in Capital, class means something else. Capital class means the stratificational system which is peculiar to the capitalist society, right? So I argue in some of my papers that, in Marx we have two clearly distinct notions of class. The first I call class one, which is the generic notion, and the second I call class two, which is the specific notion of class peculiar to the capitalist society. He could not have said that all history is the history of class struggle like that, because then all history has to be history of capitalism. Clearly, Marx does not have that in mind. So if you do that, then of course you can do something with that. But my major point is that, Indian Marxists did not look into the question of caste seriously at all, generally. except for some very exceptional people. Two people tried to do that. In English writing, there might be a lot of writing in the vernacular which I do not know of. In English, I think Kosambi tries to address this question to some extent. And Bhupendranath Datta, who is the younger brother of Vivekananda, he was a revolutionary, he was a communist. He came back to India. He wrote a book, totally neglected. It's called Studies in Indian Social Polity. I think it was published in 1934 or something. And there was a second reprint, only once, in the 1980s. I do not think it's a very successful resolution, but I think the attempt is very, very interesting. It's a very big question, you know. It's just too big to go into it in detail in a question answer session. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
I think Anna had a question, no?
I didn't have a question actually. I did use the clapping emoji. That might have been the confusion. But Shauna has a question, I believe, that she's been holding on to.
Okay, yeah, Shauna.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this introduction, and thank you to Professor Ewing for organizing this. Professor, I think the readings that we did, especially, you know, an outline to revisionist theory of modernity, has, you know, in many ways shaped the way in which I've been thinking since I started doing my research, which is, you know, a while back. And
you should not allow anyone thinking to shape your thinking. You should. Anyway, sorry.
Well, sometimes it's inevitable that, you know, some people will shape your thinking. But I have a slightly long question. I need to know, especially once you begin to theorize about what this sort of alterations to a sequentialist theory of modernity would look like. You begin to say that there are, you know, the initial conditions matter, and what exists before modernity must be structurally diverse. So we start with this claim. I wanted to ask how, you know, especially because of the second paper, does the structural diversity act as a limit to modernity as universality? And then does bringing this limit into modernity, or somehow superseding this limit in some sense, change the meaning of modernity itself? So if the initial conditions do matter, and they act as a limit against which modernity moves, then does the trajectory of modernity come to be determined by how this limit is superseded, or which limit in itself comes to be superseded? So just to, you know, quickly give an example, the manner in which quote unquote traditional societies are given autonomy, often classified through methods of legal pluralism, for example, it's not just an alibi for empire, it's also a sort of supersession of modern forms of rule taking on these so-called traditional societies. So that, you know, that is the way in which we talk about how this limit is superseded. But we also know that the constellations that modernity picks up, you know, and wants to retain as part of modernity is very carefully done. Not all traditional societies are brought into the fold of modernity, only a few are superseded. So when you talk about limits, especially, you know, once we move into the second paper, there are two ways in which those limits seem to be impacting modernity, the how and the which that you pick up. It is a long question, but it's, you know, primarily on how to treat the nature of supersession of this limit in itself when we think about modernity.
Okay, again, you know, it's a very big question, so I'll try to give you a brief answer. You know, the use of the term limit, we have to word it carefully, because you know, one is the idea of a limit to modernity, which can also have meaning, and the meaning will be that, you know, to what extent do the institutional logic of the different types of institutional logic that we associate with modernity, like the rise of capitalism, industrialization, individuation, etc. Are they able to sort of work through these societies completely? So the societies are totally transformed. Totally transformed basically means, transformation. This is an interesting thing to notice about our language. Totally transformed does not mean that the end of the transformation replicates European society. Totally transformed can also mean, I'm actually reading a book by Aditya Nigam, which has just come out or is coming out, Decolonizing Theory, which has a very interesting discussion about the work of Kullan Shannal on the rise of capitalism and primitive accumulation, etc., who also turns to this to some extent. But transformation can also mean that, the earlier structures are changed. Does not mean necessarily that the outcome of the change or the end state of the change would be something that is similar to what you get in the West. So you can keep the idea that modernity pushes through, but the pluralization of paths is not something which is countermanded. The pluralization of paths continues. So and the other point that I wanted to mention to you is that this is also something that we must notice in our thinking. You use the term traditional society. In some of the stuff that I've written, I have pointed out that traditional, in this kind of use of traditional, the meaning is essentially taken from Weber. But Weber's use of traditional, I think, has a limited use, heuristic use for his kind of analysis. But it is also dangerous in the sense that what it does is very similar to what happens to the term feudalism in Marx's discussion. So that, pre-modern India, Mughal India becomes feudal, pre-modern Middle East becomes feudal, pre-modern Africa becomes feudal, Montezuma becomes feudal in Latin America. So everything becomes feudal. So that feudal then doesn't mean anything concrete. It doesn't mean anything specific structurally. It simply means that it's pre-modern. And the Weberian term traditional, also has that tendency to. And if you go into a bit more logically, then the point is that it mistakes as an ontological characteristic, something which is basically a logical characteristic which is imposed on that society for the purposes of a certain kind of argumentation, right? Within the limits of that argumentation, of course, this is valid, right? That, like Marx is talking about pre-capitalist forms. Remember, those of you who are historians, you would remember that Hobsbawm has a very critical passage about that. Hobsbawm says that, it seems that Marx has actually forgotten everything that he has written before, that slave society, feudal society are very different. Suddenly, everything has become pre-capitalist. So in my early paper in '83, I disagreed with that quite sharply. And I said that, it's not that Marx has forgotten. Marx is making an argument which is of a very different kind. It's a contrastive argument, which allows him to make certain remarks about certain points about European society, not about Indian society. So this is something that we should keep in mind. But again, it's a deep question. What I'm happy about is that, all the questions that you've asked till now, I'm glad that all these are unanswerable questions, at least unanswerable in the limits of a discussion, unanswerable only in a very mundane human sense. That I would have said it's an answerable question if I had an answer ready-made through the work that I have done or the thinking that I have done. But I think the quality of a good question is that it pulls you into a territory which you think is an important territory to think about, but on which you do not have a pat answer. Yeah. Ovirup, I think Ovirup has a question. Shayuri? Ovirup?
Thank you, Professor Kaviraj. So I had a question sort of drawing on Shauna's question, and I was reading the article on the revisionist theory of modernity. And one of the ideas, one of the central ideas animating that text is this notion that you are concerned with how it is that the very specific history of European modernity sort of comes to frame the horizon of expectations for every non-European society, right? And there's a very short but suggestive footnote that I found very interesting, where you say that you make a difference between what you call historians' history and social scientists' history.
Yep.
And you argue that it is in this very second form, that of the social scientists' history. It is in that way that European history comes to assume a position of dominance over both cognition and imagination all over the world. So I was wondering, this made sense to me instinctively, but I couldn't put a handle on it. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on the difference or the theoretical tension between these forms of histories and how it affects the way scholars look at modernity.
Oh, that's a great question. Again, let me try to put it briefly, concisely. I have written, I don't remember where, but I have written a little bit more about this point of the historian's history and the social theorist's history. Because I think it's very, very important. And the more modern social science evolves, it becomes a question that both theorists like me, on the one side, theorists meaning theorists not in the high sense, that people like Hegel and Marx, that I mean by theory, somebody who actually thinks about the implements to which we think, so conceptual analysis kind of theory, so theory in a more mundane sense, where people who are interested in theory and people who are historians, they should think in dialogue, in consultation. I would put it this way, that Deepesh uses the term, he doesn't give much of a gloss on it, but if you follow his views, I think this is the sense in which he uses it, and I endorse that completely. He says that the history of Europe becomes hyper-real. We should think about the term hyper-real. What does hyper-real mean? And what is the language, or what is the discourse or discursive practice in which something can become hyper-real in whatever sense we put on the term now, after thinking about what hyper-real means? I think the interesting thing would be that, it's difficult for anything to become hyper-real for a historian, because a historian is a chronicler of reality. He is an observer, an analyst of a body of empirical things, right? And so it's difficult to tell a historian that, there are different levels of reality, and there's a level of the real which you cannot understand while you are grappling with the real that is accessible to you as a historian, right? The historian would be immediately skeptical of that. The historian would say, how can you say that? There's the history of an institution in India, and there's the history of an institution in Germany, right? So one is in the 20th century, the other one is the 18th century. So how can one be more real than the other, right? But I think it is important to understand that one is more real than the other. But for one to become more real than the other, the historian cannot do it. The historian produces a history. But by a very insidious, I'm not saying insidious now in a bad sense. Insidious meaning something that we find is subliminal, subtle, and so we do not, it escapes our attention in a certain sense. So in a way, when the history of something that happens in Germany in the 19th century, the rise of capitalism and the coexistence of capitalism with certain types of beliefs in predestination and things like that, right? That is history. Weber is doing whatever he's doing. Let us suspend the name for what he's doing. So whatever he's doing on the basis of that history, right? At this point, the history is the kind of history that you do, right, as a historian. But what Weber does at the end of Weber's operation or performance, that history is actually put into the shape of a different kind of language, right? It becomes a language of social theory. This is how things happen. Not this is how things happened in Germany at that particular moment, but this is how things happen. So notice one thing, notice how the chronotopic feature, that it is a particular time and it's a particular space, that tends to drop off, right? And it tends to rise in a certain sense. So this is the process of something becoming hyperreal. Hyperreal in the sense that you are sitting in Kolkata and doing a history of the municipality in Kolkata, but people would tell you that, look at this book by Weber on the city, right? Or look at a book which is on the rise of the municipal institutions in England. I'm not saying that you should not do it, right? Because there can be processes of city building in the 19th century in modernity in England, which are then copied, imitated, or filtered in as influences into city making in Kolkata, right? But hyper-real means that you put the consequences of historical knowledge into a form, right, which operates in a different language. And when it operates in a different language, it actually then acquires the capacity of influencing people who are doing history in other places like that, right? So I do not deny the importance of something like this, right? We have to see things which are general patterns, try to give them names, try to understand, different layers of historical happening. I think no historian would deny that, right? But I think, I'm not saying that I have a full answer to what you are saying, but I think I have a question, which seems to me to be an important question. The relation between social theory and history. But the only thing that I'm adding to that is a reminder to both you and me, both the historian and the person who is doing the history of theory, that under social theory, there is also a history which is either unnamed or a history which is transformed into a different language, right? And it's very important to understand the logical operation of knowledge at the level of history going into and becoming knowledge at the level of theory. And what does that mean? Because if we understand that, then we can control it. Control it in the sense that I can say that, well, it's because of this, that this generalization of Weber is valid for me, and I would run with it. And this is something which I do not find valid. For instance, take the discussion in Casanova against the Weber thing. What is his first argument? His first argument is a completely commonsensical way of putting this. He says that, you say that this is the connection between Protestantism and the rise of capitalism. But capitalism also rises in Italy. Capitalism rises in some parts of France for Catholic. Capitalism rises in Spain, right? So what you are doing is you are taking something which happened in Protestant countries, Germany and England, right? And then you are hypostatizing that into something which is a kind of, which is, which is a mandatory process for the development of modernity. So that's, what I had in mind when I put in that footnote. But this is also the process of writing, because, when you write, you get a glimpse, and I'm saying getting a glimpse deliberately. It's not that you have a clear picture. You get a glimpse of a question which arises through something that you have thought about just recently. What I believe in is that, I would actually make a record of it. So I put it in a footnote so that other people can see that, and then if they think that that's an important question, they can do something about it, or I can come back to it later on and then try to do something about that. Yeah. Shayoti?
Thank you, Professor Kaviraj, for those articles and the introduction today. So my question was, I don't know, it's in my head, it's more specific, and it's to do with your Marx and post-colonial thinking essay. So, so as I read it, so one of the central things that you're doing in this essay is to talk about like the historical thinking in Marx, how he thinks about history and temporality, and that you say is an innovative innovative turn in him as opposed to prior thinkers. So I had a specific question about one of the things that you said when you're comparing state of nature theories and the Marxian understanding of unalienated human state, like primitive accumulation. And you make this comment about how the unalienated initial condition is an improvement on state of nature in terms of history and temporality, because state of nature assumes that it's in the distant historical time, something has happened, state of nature, and then we have this development of society, social contract, and so on. Whereas with the Marxian sequence, you have atemporality, where unalienated initial condition is atemporal. So I was wondering if you could say a little more about those distinctions, about how this is atemporal, whereas state of nature is not. And also then I was wondering, if that is the case, then like what about this argument about historicism in Marx and atemporality? Like at the first read, it sounds a little like, because you're saying his historical ideation is important, so then this becomes atemporal. So just that relation.
No, it's a great question. Great, because it's the kind of question that would delight people who are doing Indian-style intellectual history. If you have the Nyayikas and the others and the Kashmiri theorists, they would say we have these two words in Shankuka, and I disagree with that because of this. So I'm delighted to do that, because I think that's how we should read text. But I think what I'm saying seems at least clear to my mind. I think there are three ways in which you are thinking about the present, right? You were Marx, you were thinking about the present in Germany in the 1840s, right? And you are trying to make an argument about your present, which you cannot make without making a reference to the past, right? But notice that I'm using the term past in a very vague sense, in a very open, general sense. But the past can be, you can call it theorized, or the past can be conceptualized in different ways. And I think that I see three different ways of conceptualizing the past. One way of conceptualizing the past is state of nature. Think of Hobbes. Logically, Hobbes' question has a similar structure. He's thinking about England during his time, and he thinks that he must make a point that society is created by human beings through their common consent, etc. So for that, the fabular device, the fable of the social contract is important, but the fabulistic or fabular device of the social contract has a temporal character. Because Hobbes does not say that this is something which is an imaginary thing. The social contract is a very interesting, complex concept, because it's an image of the past, right? It seems that it's an image of the past which Hobbes believes or Locke believes existed in human history at some point of time, right? But see how my own language in interpreting Hobbes and Locke is becoming loose and vague when I'm trying to say this at some point of time, somewhere, at some point of time, etc. Right? So it is an invocation of the past. It's an extremely underdetermined, if you use analytical terminology, it's a very, very underdetermined understanding of the past. What does underdetermination mean? Underdetermination means that you are thinking about something, but you are not clear about the specifics of that thing. And the central, trivial example would be that if you can conceive of Hamlet as a figure, but if somebody says that, tell me what is the shoe size of Hamlet, you cannot say anything about the shoe size of Hamlet, so it's underdetermined. But this is an underdetermination of a very extreme type when you think of the state of nature, right? That is the sense in which it is heavily underdetermined. But it is the kind of, it is still a temporal relation, right? The reason why your question is so interesting about Marx is that it's linked to the question of the Althusser question about whether Marx's thinking changes profoundly from the economic philosophical manuscripts to later writing. There was a time when I was too much of a kind of, admirer of Althusser to believe that everything is right about that. And I have now changed my mind on that slightly. But on this question, I think Althusser is right, because this is the second case of present and past. So Marx is thinking about his present in Germany in 1844, and he has to invoke a past from which the present has moved away. Look at how the past is conceived in the economic philosophical manuscript. That past in the economic philosophical manuscript is not a historical past. It's the nature of man, right? It is the nature of man in a certain, or not the past, the contrast to the capitalist mode of being is the nature of man. And where does it get it from? He gets it from Adam Smith and the British political economy tradition, which actually locates some of the impulses of a capitalist economy not in history. Their argument is not that historically human beings have come to have an economy like this. Their argument, what is their argument? Their argument is that intrinsically human beings are like that. And artificially, through religion, etc., there are impediments. Things are put on a human being. And so this natural instinct to barter and trade is covered up and smothered by social conventions and social institutions, right? So when those institutions sort of fall apart, then this natural instinct of human being to barter and trade emerges, right? And therefore you can actually, so for Adam Smith, the rise of capitalism, right, is not the rise of a historical society. It's the rise of something which is imprinted or embedded in human nature, expressing itself because artificial constraints on it by conventional societies are taken away. So my reading of Marx is that, the wonderful essay on estrangement of labor, it's a critique of capitalist labor, but it's a critique of capitalist labor by a reference not to a historically pre-existing society, but to an ahistorical nature of man argument. It's very powerful. I think it's extremely powerful. The understanding of an unalienated nature. In my younger days, I felt that, it doesn't have much value beyond this kind of thing, but now I feel that it does have a lot of value, right? But it's a different kind of argument. It's not a state of nature. It is nature in a very different sense, right? So I'm implicitly saying that in European political thought also, the term nature changes from the time when it's used as part of the phrase state of nature to Adam Smith and Marx, where it is actually seen not as state of nature, but nature of man, the natural state of man, right? And then the third way of criticizing capitalism, criticizing your present, when Marx is 1848, Communist Manifesto, just 4 years later. But look at how he now understands it. Now, the contrast is not between capitalism and human nature. That argument does not disappear because, capitalism is seen as degrading. Capitalism is seen as something which impoverishes humanity, etc. But the contrast between capitalism, with capitalism now, is of a prior existing society, which is now called feudalism. So what I'm saying is that, logically, these are three types of positing capitalism and finding out what is wrong about capitalism through a contrast. In the first case, it's a fabulist temporal contrast with the state of nature. In the second case, it's not a temporal contrast. It's a logical contrast between the nature of man and the degraded nature of man under capitalism. And in the third case, it's a truly historical argument where, historical argument where the contrast is between capitalism and feudalism, what had existed before, right? So I think Marx is moving into an argument which is becoming truly historical And one point that I forgot to mention in my initial remark, which is a very, very important point for my own understanding of my own thinking. When I was in Oxford, I started reading, trying to think about what does it mean to think historically about political thought. The Skinner-Dunn kind of argument. I felt that it was philosophically shallow in the sense that it simply said we should think historically, but it did not go into the question, what does thinking historically mean, right? Think contextually. I told Skinner quite often that, it seems to me, reading his work primarily, that context should be a verb, context should not be a noun. Context is the activity of finding context rather than, something which exists there for me to discover. But anyway, what I should have said in my introduction is that through reading that and through reading Dilthey and Gadamer, which I read very early, but I felt increasingly after that Marx is somebody who is an unnamed figure, even by the German, an unnamed figure in the long chain of historicist thinking coming down from Hegel. Nobody would deny that the origins of historicist thinking is in Hegel. Hegel is not a full historicist in the sense in which Dilthey is or Gadamer is. But read Gadamer. Gadamer will himself actually say that the beginning of this kind of thinking seriously is from Hegel. But the genealogy is usually Hegel, Dilthey, because Dilthey uses objective mind in his later writing, the nature of the historical world. So Hegel, Dilthey, Gadamer, Hegel, Schleiermacher, Dilthey, Gadamer, etc. That is the line. I am now absolutely convinced that the line of historical thinking should be Hegel, Marx, Dilthey, Schleiermacher, Dilthey, Gadamer, etc. And there again, I think Lukács is a very interesting figure because Lukács, I think, actually studied with Weber briefly, but he certainly studied with people who are neo-Kantians, Weber's contemporaries in Germany. And Habermas has a very interesting chapter on Lukács, tucked away in the theory of communicative action, which I found very, very helpful because he says that what is interesting about Lukács is that Lukács is trying to hold together the tradition coming from Marx and the tradition coming from Weber. But the Weberian tradition by this time, is already a self-recognized historicist tradition because Weber is coming in the wake of Dilthey. So that's why, I see Marx as a central figure in the evolution of German historicism itself. But if you open a book on German historicism, I'm sure you would not find a chapter on Marx. So that's why I think that move in Marx from critiquing capitalism in the name of a human nature to critiquing capitalism historically, where you say that there's no human nature waiting for us to go back into, right? It's an imaginative construct. And I think I now feel that there's something very important and lacking in Marx. Should I say that? Let me say that because we're having a general discussion. Even for me, I think it's a very sacrilegious thing to say. But I feel, I'm writing a paper now responding to a debate about Tonius, Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, the loss of community in the modern world. And I shall put it in just 5 sentences. I think it's very clear that one of Marx's discontent about the rise of capitalism is the loss of community, right? So there's a deep lament about the loss of community. At the same time, because Marx is thinking historically, clearly he has a fully functioning example of community in front of him, which is the medieval Christian community, right? But he simultaneously says that I lament for community, but not the Christian medieval community. I do not want to go back to medieval times to achieve community again, which puts him, I think, in a very strange position because he says, without community, human life is degraded. But the only example of community that exists in my history I do not want to go back there because it's too infused with repression. How do you create community now without dipping into the past, without taking something from the medieval past? Here, I think what Marx does, now it seems to me, I need to think a bit more and read a bit more. I think Marx makes a mistake in simply leaning on, taking for granted an argument that you get from Hegel. In the philosophy of history, Hegel's argument is clear and I think flawless, logically in terms of what he is trying to do. There are the three forms of sociability: the family, which is the true community; civil society, which can never produce community because it's based on competition, right? But society cannot survive like that. So there must be a re-establishment of the principle of community on the scale of the society as a whole. But we can do that because the state is that, if you fall back into Hegelian language, the state is that universal principle, right? Now, and why is the state that universal principle? For two reasons primarily, to my reading of Hegel. One is the bureaucracy. Remember, Hegel calls the bureaucracy the universal class. Marx picks that phrase up from Hegel and applies it to the proletariat. But universal class is the phrase that Hegel invents and applies to the bureaucracy, right? So why is state the universal principle? Because of bureaucracy, which is the universal class, and most powerfully because of nationalism, right? And it's because of that that even war actually fosters that kind of nationalism and a sense of a universal feeling among people who live in society. So that countermands, the dispersing tendency in the capitalist economy. So from Hegel's point of view, the argument is perfect. You cannot actually find any fault with the argument. But notice one thing. What is interesting is that in Hegel, the basic argument in the third part is that we need community, right? And we also have a good implement for the creation of community, which is the modern state. It would do part of it through the work of the bureaucracy, which is universal in the sense of non-discriminatory, right? It would treat everybody equally. And on the other side, whenever you have a threat to the state, or even otherwise, you have this wonderful, warm, emotional feeling of all of us are Germans, all of us are Hindus, or whatever, right? So that actually produces community. So there's no problem. In fact, we need community, but there is a community at hand. There's an implement which can produce community. The reason why I think Marx does not think through this clearly is that Marx does not accept either of those 2 points from Hegel. Read his very early but very long critique of Hegel's philosophy of right as a whole, and you'll see that long discussion about Hegel's point that bureaucracy is the universal class. Marx is not persuaded by that. He rejects that idea. So that on the one side, and it's quite obvious that Marx rejects nationalism. He thinks that nationalism is a dangerous force rather than a force of true community, right? So where does it place Marx? I think it places Marx in a very strange situation that we need community. We cannot go back to the, Peter Bruegel kind of picture of the village life, village community, etc., medieval, because it's romantic, right? And for Marx, the problem then is that he's not persuaded by Hegel that either the bureaucratic character or the nationalistic character of the state, would produce community, right? So then what? I think the trouble is that Marx still has this vestigial Hegelian influence of thinking that the task of building community, right, should be given to the state. I don't think it's actually thought out very well. The economic argument is thought out because in Marx, very often you will find that when he's talking about the social character of production and the individual character of appropriation of profit making, etc., the social character of production, he says that those factories should be state-owned. I don't think there's any technical problem in that. State-owned factories have been shown not to work very well, but for different reasons. You can say that the factories, because they're social, should be state-owned. But you are not thinking of that. Community is something more elusive, something is different. It is also much more important. It is something which is more affective, right? And ultimately what you are doing is you are giving the responsibility of producing that affect for community to the state, by default. That's what I think now, on this question. But I've seen this only very recently while trying to think about Tony. Because there's so much of influence of Marx on Tony's in the Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft book. But this is very new. In fact, if you had asked me last year, I wouldn't have said this. But am I clear about the three, the logical distinction between the three ways of finding a contrast to capitalism? The state of nature contrast, the nature of man contrast, which is ahistorical, and feudalism contrast, which is historical. Right. Yeah. Rishi?
I have a more methodological question. In your analysis of the debate between the Indian Marxists and the Indian sociocultural anthropologists, the anthropologists were really focusing on the local in their assertion that caste was really the fundamental building block of Indian society. And of course, that then kind of went down a reductionist rabbit hole. So they're kind of making that reductionist analysis, while the Indian Marxists are kind of so based in the textuality that they aren't really kind of seeing what's actually happening in the social processes in India. So my question is kind of where is the local in this kind of disaggregation between these discourses? Could the local possibly maybe kind of bring some of these intellectual differences together? Or could the local possibly be a potential for some type of interdisciplinary analysis that's kind of looking at multiplicity instead of trying to find a static kind of root of Indian society that's looking at different contexts and different places?
Okay. Give me just a minute, I'll come back.
Okay.
So I just might say while he's dashed off, we probably just in the future, do you think it is important? What we didn't do today was give a 5-minute break like halfway through. Is that something that people feel is important, or are you comfortable with just dashing off if you want to? Any thoughts about that?
I think the 5-minute break might be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll try to remember to do that next time. And if I don't, let me know. Maybe send me a chat or something.
Okay.
That you might. Because I tend to not do that. I tend to just kind of focus on what's going on. I'm sure by the time he answers this question, we're going to be running out of time. So I just want to thank you for your great questions. I had never done something like this before, either a master class, what that even might mean. It's like one of these phrases that we hear Sudipta talking about, it's like feudal society with master classes, but what is it? So now I have a better sense of what it is. And I'm just sort of giving some wrap-up comments while you were gone so that you'll have maximum time to answer the question.
Okay. I think it's a very important question. I think since you asked it as a methodological question, let me also answer it methodologically. I think what you get in Marx, I think in the history of Marxism, I see the history of Marxism as being divided into different stages according to the logic of demand of its history. And I think in Marx's case, the movement of thought is essentially upwards, in the sense that if you look at Marx's early writings, he's simply thinking about Germany, Rhineland, Germany, then Europe. But what I find very wonderful in Marx is his self-awareness about this and the way he sets up the question of capitalism to himself, that he starts with the question, how can you make a revolution in Germany? That pushes him into thinking that, what are the social forces which are likely to support a revolution? Which pushes him into thinking that, how are these social forces created? And then he realizes that these social forces are created by something which is not happening in Germany, but happening in all of Europe. And it's called the rise of capitalism. And so then his question is constituted this way, that I must try to understand uh, what are the lineaments of this society and its internal structural logic, and then its internal variations, etc. But the movement is upward in the sense that, you look for something which is more and more general. I think after it creates a danger, because I think it creates a possibility that some Marxists would think that um, the logic of Marxism is similar to the logic of natural sciences, fitting individual cases to overarching general laws, etc., which I think has been one of the major problems with some strands of Marxism always. But I think after some time, when you turn to Gramsci, this is why I'm so attracted to Gramsci, not just because of his theory of power. I feel that in Gramsci, you get systematic, I'm saying systematic because there are sporadic attempts to register locality or particularity, specificity in other Marxists as well. But I see Gramsci as a kind of theorist of historical difference, systematic historical difference. I wrote a paper a long time back at Partho's invitation. Partho did a seminar in Kolkata, I think in 86, 87, on Gramsci in South Asia, and it was later published in in the EPW. I had a paper which I did not finish in time for publication, so it was never published. It was called Gramsci and Different Kinds of Different. Partho is now editing a volume on Gramsci in India, and he has asked me to, he is including that. In that, the argument is that I say that I noticed an obverse logic in in Gramsci's thinking to Marxism, that now the general theory of capitalism as an economy is in place. The political side of it is undeveloped, so he's trying to develop that by elaborating his theory about hegemony, um, you know, base superstructure, political, civil society, political society. But there's also an equally important movement in Gramsci towards the specificity of Italy, um, the specificity of Italian history. So the point that I make very abstractly in the theory of modernity paper, that initial conditions actually constrain, initial conditions in some ways partly determine the logic of capitalism later. That is implicit in Gramsci's understanding of the Italian development. So that's why there's so much of emphasis on the earlier history of Italy. If the rise of capitalism meant cancellation of the effects of earlier history, then that, that enormous inquiry into Italian history going back into the Renaissance would have been unnecessary. Because then in a, Vivek Chibber kind of way, that is of course a history, but it would be erased and can wait for the rise of capitalism, and that would be irrelevant. Clearly not irrelevant for Gramsci. And so therefore I persuade myself that, therefore the logic of Gramsci's thinking is like what I'm saying there. But notice what he's doing later. He is not satisfied with just seeing the difference in Italy. The deep emphasis on the Southern question, continually the Southern question. Even Italy is not sufficiently singular for him. The Southern question has to be seen as something which is particular within the particular, right? And so on the other side, look at the emphasis on Catholicism. I read his emphasis on Catholicism as a kind of slightly counter-Weberian emphasis. That in Weber, you get a wonderful theory of how a strand of Christianity plays a role in the rise of capitalism. If you follow Gramsci, then the argument will be that, that does not mean that Catholicism plays exactly the same role vis-a-vis capitalism. I cannot take it for granted. So I have to see what is the role of capitalism. So Christianity, which is the singularity, is broken up into Catholicism and Protestantism. So the recurrence of the emphasis on Catholicism itself, to my mind, is actually going along the logic of particularity, the logic of uniqueness and locality of different situations. So that's why I think it's not surprising, because Gramsci is a Hegelian Marxist in many ways. In fact, the influence of Hegel comes to him twice, through the reading of Hegel and through the reading of Croce, right? So Croce also mediates some Hegelian influences into Gramsci. So it's not surprising that I find the coincidence between the logic of Gramsci's thinking. This is why I call him a theorist of difference within Marxism, rather than the theories of singularity within Marxism, because it coincides with the Dilthey kind of emphasis, saying that the history of every society at a certain level is unique, and the understanding of history essentially means trying to grasp that. So the historicist emphasis, right, that the enterprise of human science or social science is the capture of particularity, uniqueness, etc. I see a logic which is similar in Gramsci. I don't think it's so much there in Marx in his mature writing. In his early writings, yes, but in Marx's early writings, the scaffolding of Marxist theory is not yet there, right? But once the scaffolding is there, once that structure is in place, people like Gramsci see a tendency towards an excessive move towards the universal, etc. But let me also make another point very quickly, just one sentence, because it came up in somebody's remark, either Shauna's or Ovirup or Shairi. I think Ovirup said something about the universal. We must note that the concept of the universal has at least two forms. One meaning of the term universal is invariant. Universal means that you have a cluster of cases, you have a range of different instances, and you are talking about something, a quality or feature or something, which is invariant across all of them. That is the meaning of universality. Like the structure of the human body, wherever you find a human being, he will have 2 ears, right? So that kind of thing. But think of a universal like language. Language is a universal. Wherever you find a human being, you would find language. Does not mean that the language is invariant. So we can have a variant universal and an invariant universal, right? So I think Marxists should give more attention to use of terms or concepts like universal. Universal, I'm sometimes a bit irritated by this, that the term universal is thrown around only with one single meaning. But clearly, in the most obvious sense, in terms of the language that we use every day, it has at least two meanings. If you look at language. Yeah.
Okay, well, we've come to 12 o'clock. I just want to raise, sort of reacting to what you just said, in terms of the specifics, the local, and the examples you gave. Well, I guess language could be added to that now, but sort of variants of Christianity, for example. And I'm just wondering, just as something to think about, how would we characterize this local within Marxist theory itself? Does it get subsumed into the categories that he uses?
That's a very good question. I think it's a difficult question. I don't think it doesn't have resolution. I've thought a little bit about it. So it's not a question for which I I haven't got any response. It's not a full answer because it's a question that should be thought through more deeply. But in within Marxism, let me give you an example from a very conventional Marxist economic discussion. Remember that in the 1960s, 70s, we had a discussion about the spread of the capitalist mode of production. And there were two sides broadly. One side said that when you say that the capitalist mode of production has arisen in any society, what you mean, this is also central to the Kohl and Schnell discussion, which is very, very interesting. What it means is that in that economy, the capitalist mode of production is now the dominant mode of production, right? So that is the meaning of the rise of capitalism, or that's the meaning of saying that some economy is the capitalist economy. Some others said that no, that does not actually square with the real history, real economic history of capitalism. Because capitalism is an international structure, and it is a structure which is quite capable of coming to a society and transforming some parts of that economy into the capitalist mode of production in the strict sense of the term, but leaving major parts of the economy in pre-capitalist mode or non-capitalist modes of production, right? But subsuming them, right? Subsuming them in a structure, right? Which is a kind of heterogeneous structure. So the economy is heterogeneous. All parts of the economy are not exactly of the same kind. And certainly all parts of the economy do not obey the logic of the capitalist mode of production. But capitalism as an economy has this capacity, of extracting value or extracting what it wants from sub-economies, which follow different types of rules, right? And capitalism is not always in a hurry to change them and to turn them into a capitalist economy. And I'll give you one instance, which is also an economic instance. There was a very interesting discussion once to which Amit Bhaduri